What's up guys, my name is Ace, and a hot topic I've been seeing in the community lately for XDefiant is, should the Phantom faction have more of a downside to compensate for the 120 HP that they have, or should they just not even have 120 HP? Should they have the same health as everyone else, and a different passive instead? I've seen plenty of talk about this in the community, lots of people throwing out various ideas, and I basically just wanted to share my 2 cents on this and go through a lot of the ideas people have shared, share my opinions on those, as well as what I would like to see done, if anything, to the Phantom faction. And before we get into the individual suggestions, I just want to start this video off saying, I don't really have a serious issue with the Phantom faction in their current state in XDefiant. If there's just the odd Phantom player here or there on the enemy team, then I don't really change anything that I do. I just maybe try to aim for the head a bit more against those players. Whereas if I notice several people on the enemy team using Phantoms, that's when I just switch to one of the guns that's really effective at taking out Phantom players, like the M16 or one of the marksman rifles, for instance. For those of you that have missed this, I did a deep dive into this not too long ago, and I found several guns and setups that completely nullify that extra health that the Phantom players have, and they allow you to kill those Phantom players as if they were regular players. So if you are somebody that's been having a problem fighting against Phantom players and you haven't seen that video yet, I definitely recommend checking that out. I will leave a link to that in the description below. But because we have these guns that are basically perfect counters to that Phantom's extra HP, I don't have a serious issue with the Phantom faction, at least in regular public matches. I will say for ranked play, even though I haven't really had any time to play ranked, I have heard from a lot of people that it's apparently just infested with Phantom players and like everybody always selects Phantoms. And in that case, I definitely think ranked should have a faction limit, so only 1 or maybe 2 of the same faction on each team. But I consider that to be a separate issue, and I'm mainly talking from the perspective of just a regular public match player. And in that case, like I said, I don't have a serious issue with this, but at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to some adjustment here. And the primary reason for this is when we look at the Cleaners faction, they get that bonus burn damage when you shoot enemy players, and in exchange for that passive, there's actually a trade-off, and that is you lose 10% to your damage range on your gun when using that faction. And since Phantoms are basically just on the flip side of that with bonus health instead of bonus damage, and these types of passives are having a direct impact on face-to-face gunfights, whether that's increasing damage or health, then balancing-wise, I think it does make sense to have some sort of a trade-off for that ability. So let's go over some of the suggestions I've seen thrown around in the community. This is mainly coming from the XDefiant subreddit, but I've also seen people in my comment section providing some of these. And the first one that's come up quite a bit is, instead of giving 120 HP for Phantom players, eliminate that extra health so they have the same health as everyone else, and instead replace that passive with explosive or flash resistance. And when it comes to this one, while I would definitely love to see a faction with that sort of passive at some point in the future, I think that would be great for objective players to have that ability built into their actual character. In my opinion, this isn't really well suited to Phantoms, as I find it stacks a bit too heavy with their abilities, especially their ultimate ability. As it is right now, they have that mag shield they can throw up, or they can pull out the riot shield as well, and then when they get their ultimate, they have that bubble shield around them. And one of the forms of counterplay to all of those things is throwing a nade through or around those shields, since you're unable to deal direct bullet damage to them in those cases, as long as they're using their shields effectively. So if you were to also build in this explosive resistance, now I find that that passive would be stacking a little too heavy with their abilities by eliminating one of the current counterplays to their abilities. And I think every ability should have a variety of ways to counter that ability. So that's why I'm not really on board with that one, at least for Phantoms. Again, I would love to see that passive come at some point in the future for a different faction. As for the next suggestion I've seen floating around, this is, instead of giving Phantom players 20 extra HP to their base health value, instead, give them 100 HP like everyone else, but allow them to spawn in with a bit of armor, 20 HP worth of armor. And this would effectively make it so you get that armor for your first gunfight, and it will help you win that first gunfight, but then beyond that, your armor is destroyed, and now you're just going to be the same as everyone else. And then I also saw some suggestions that maybe this armor should be on a cooldown, so after it's destroyed, it will replenish itself eventually over time, but it's not going to be always active like it currently is. And while this is definitely an interesting and very creative idea, personally, I find it to just be a little overcomplicated for a passive ability. Passive abilities are meant to be things that are like always active on your character. And when it comes to having an armor plate like this that is there for the odd gunfight here or there, but it's not really there all the time, to me that doesn't really sound like a passive ability. That sounds much more like an active ability in the game, and I find that that may overcomplicate things, and also it would just lead to inconsistency in gunfights against Phantom players, where sometimes they've got 120 HP, other times they don't have 120 HP, and I think it would just make the Phantom faction a little bit awkward to use. So moving on to the next suggestion that I've seen, this is maintain their current passive ability at 120 HP, but increase their health regeneration delay. So you get more health up front going into a gunfight, but it's going to take you longer to recover from that gunfight and get back up to full health compared to other characters. And this one immediately brought up thoughts of synergy with the Libertad faction. If you had somebody on Libertad staying within a radius of you while you're taking damage as a Phantom, then it would nullify this trade-off by constantly triggering your health regeneration delay. And the idea of having those synergies between factions is definitely interesting, but outside of those cases, I think it would largely remove the tanky feeling that they're going for with the Phantom faction. If that extra health is only good for one fight, and then you're actually worse off HP-wise than other factions because it takes you much longer to recover after a fight, with how often your next gunfight is coming up fairly shortly after the previous one, I think I would actually rather just have a regular character that heals at a normal rate, or use the Libertad faction, because in that case, the Libertad would feel way more tanky than the tanky faction would. So again, this is another suggestion where it's not horrible, but I just don't think it's the perfect solution here. And this brings us to the last suggestion, and this is the one that I had as well, but I've also seen many other people independently come up with this, so I don't want to be the one that claims all the credit for this or anything. But I think if you're going to give the Phantom players 120 HP, it would make total sense to give them a slight movement speed penalty. And I'm talking very slight, like 2.5 to 5% maximum, just to make it so Phantoms are clearly not going to be the best option for people that want to be highly aggressive, for people that want to get those really good opening routes and get to that power position faster than the enemies are able to get to the countering power position. I think that's totally fine. A tanky player should be slow. And I like this solution for a few reasons. The first one is it's simple, and oftentimes the best solutions are the simple ones. It doesn't overcomplicate things, it doesn't make things confusing to players, it's basic. If you're using a Phantom player, you're going to be slightly slower than the others. The second is this solution would fit with the intended role of Phantoms. It's clear they designed this faction to be the tank in the game, and in most FPS games that have various roles, and one of those roles is the tanky one, typically those players are going to be moving a little bit slower. And this brings me to the final reason, this trade-off would fit nicely with the abilities that the Phantom players have. It's not something that's fighting against their abilities, it makes sense to go alongside their abilities. So if you're using the mag shield, for instance, typically you're not rushing around like a madman and flanking the enemy team. Instead, you're locking down lanes, you're holding positions, and therefore this movement speed reduction wouldn't really have a negative impact on you if you're playing to the intended role of the faction, whereas if you're trying to go outside of the intended role, that's where it's going to start to hold you back a little bit compared to the other factions that aren't designed to be tanks and don't have that extra health. So with all of that combined, to me at least, this seems like the best way forward if they are going to be making an adjustment to the Phantoms. And again, I want to reiterate here, if they do nothing to the Phantoms, I'm fine with that. I don't think it's currently a game-breaking issue, at least in public matches. Again, ranked play may be a different story, but also I think in ranked play, you should have a faction limit. And if you were only able to have one Phantom player on a team in ranked play, in their current state, I think that would be totally fine. But with that, of course, this is a highly subjective video. These are all just my opinions on the matter, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this in those comments down below. When it comes to those Phantom players, first off, do you have an issue with their current passive ability having that extra 20 HP with no trade-off attached to that? Or do you think it's just fine as it is? And second, if you do think there should be an adjustment to this, which solution do you like best? Is it something outlined in today's video, or is it something totally different? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.